Nick Redfern, how do you keep up with all these books? Like you are a monster, man.
Well, basically, Mike, I work full-time as a writer anyway. I don't just sort of do the books, I do the sort of mainstream journalism as well, just regular news stories. So, I guess when you write full-time, you kind of sort of split one day between doing an article for a newspaper and then 2 days working on a book. So, I'm sort of constantly cranking something out at least, I guess.
So are you, if you don't mind me asking, you live in Texas, but you're from the UK?
Yeah, I'm originally from England. Me and my wife live in Dallas. And I've been over about 11 years, something like that. So, and, try and get back at least once a year to England and just catch up with everybody and, see what's going on.
So what inspired you to unravel these mysteries about NASA, Nick?
Well, I guess more than anything else, one of the main reasons was because, when anybody talks about NASA and conspiracy theories, there's always a tendency to focus on the more well-known things like, the face on Mars, did we go to the moon, was it all a hoax, that sort of thing. But over the years, when you kind of write books and articles, people contact you to relate their experiences. And I found, going through the sort of archives and files of letters and things I've had from people over the years, I'd actually got a lot of leads that pointed in the direction of NASA. For example, people who'd worked at NASA or who were working on NASA with NASA contractor companies and talking about their UFO experiences. And I thought, well, there's a lot of material here relative to NASA that people won't have seen before. And of course, not just as someone who writes books, but reads books as well, you want the audience and the reader to be able to get something new rather than just, going over old ground. So more than anything else, that was probably one of the main considerations in writing the book, was the fact that, I was able to bring a lot of new cases forward. And I think, people want that. You don't want to sort of spend $15 on a book and think, hang on a minute, this is just rehashed or whatever.
So I kind of want to start off with the secret space program, because I know that you've mentioned that before also on other shows. So I guess the $80 trillion question is there a secret space program that is going on and being kept from the American people?
Well, this is an interesting area because, if you look historically at the space program, when the Apollo astronauts landed on the moon in 1969, if you look back at the original newspaper articles around the world even, and the statements coming out of NASA, the Apollo missions were sort of perceived as being the first step or the first armada, if you like, to having far more extensive missions, manned missions, to the moon. And there was a lot of talk about building like a moon base, a sort of a lunar colony that would be established and grow larger in size over time, and then using that as kind of a staging post to send missions to Mars, etc. And, the plan was to sort of, as I said, use the original moon landings as a vehicle for going further into the solar system, etc. But it's almost a case, if you look at it in black and white terms, we made sort of a short hop, skip and jump to the moon on a few missions, came back, and then not much happened between then and the space shuttle in 1981, and, that's soon to be retired. So, in other words, all these grand plans didn't come to fruition unless, as some people believe they actually did, but it was done on a more sort of clandestine basis behind the scenes. And there are a number of researchers who've made sort of valid contributions to this area about having spoken with NASA insiders and also more military insiders. Many people have suggested the idea that if there is a clandestine space program, it's actually not one of NASA's. NASA, ironically, may be in the dark. It could be some more of like a highly classified military program or something like that. And, for me, if you look at the way our technology has advanced over the last, say, half a century, if you look at things like atomic weaponry or computers, the sheer extent to which they've advanced. But, the Apollo missions that went to the moon, they were just sort of basic brute force rockets. You know, you fill a fuel tank with fuel and use it to propel a rocket into the sky. That's pretty much what happens with the space shuttle 40-something years on after we went to the moon. You know, you just have this huge fuel tank to which the shuttle's strapped, basically. So it's almost like every other aspect of technology is massively advanced, but with spaceflight, we're still reliant upon regular rocketry. And to me, that kind of seems illogical, you know, that aspect of technology wouldn't also have advanced. And I think one of the more interesting stories of recent years is that of Gary McKinnon, a British computer hacker who hacked into the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas in 2001. And as I'm sure you know, there's this big whole legal process that's been going on for years with attempts to get McKinnon extradited for trial in the United States. And his legal team say, no, he should stand trial in England, et cetera, et cetera. But, you know, I mean, the guy's out on bail. He has to still report to his local police station. But he's not prevented from speaking out about his actions. And one of the things that he said, and which has been sort of widely reported in, you know, the mainstream media even, never mind just UFO publications, is that he claims to have seen files on NASA computers that reference so-called non-terrestrial officers, very sort of strange wording. And McKinnon's view, which may well be the correct one, was that, you know, non-terrestrial obviously means not of this earth. Officers kind of sounds like a fleet of military personnel. When you put those two together, you know, an off-planet fleet of military personnel, it does sound almost like a secret astronaut program. And that's exactly what McKinnon concluded it could well be. And, you know, who knows, he may be right. You know, he may have stumbled upon, you know, the sort of key to what lies at the heart of this clandestine space program.
Is it possible that the majority of the black budget money is going towards the secret space program?
Well, yeah, I think, you know, that's entirely possible. I think the big problem today is when you look at things like UFOs, the more that our technology advances, the more and more difficult it becomes to differentiate between, quote, their UFOs and our UFOs. You know, and I think there's a very good argument for saying that some UFOs, at least, very, you know, highly advanced ones, are actually classified prototype military vehicles, whether aircraft or even spacecraft. You know, and I think when we talk about black budget programs, this would be the ideal way to fund such an operation. You know, I mean, I don't personally believe that the vast majority of people in NASA know anything about, you know, UFO conspiracies or secret space programs. You know, I'm sure 99% of them are just dedicated workers, you know, looking into furthering our knowledge of the solar system and outer space and space exploration. And I think this goes for all government agencies. You know, you don't just join the CIA and you're suddenly briefed on what happened at Roswell. You know, you're just told what you need to know to do your job. And I think that's how a lot of these potential, you know, secret space program operations that could possibly be funded by black budget projects, that's how they work and how they succeed, because you only tell the people who need to know, you know. And even if you have contractors building the craft, well, if somebody's working on a propulsion system, somebody else is working on another aspect, they may actually not all know what each other's doing. So, you know, the end result, whatever the craft is, just a small body of people even get to see that. So I think, you know, there are very valid ways as to how a secret space program could actually, handled in the right way, could be very easily and successfully coordinated.
I don't want to veer off too much into the JFK assassination, but I have to ask this question. Could this be a major reason why Kennedy got assassinated, because he was going to expose the secret space program?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually a very interesting area. I don't necessarily say it's just a secret space program, but, you know, the whole tying also with UFOs and Kennedy. This is actually an area I've been quietly researching for a long time. And you find a lot of players in the UFO field who were also deeply involved in the Kennedy assassination, one being a man named Guy Bannister, who was actually an acquaintance of Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans. And he was, if people have seen the movie JFK, the Oliver Stone film, you see character in that film is played by Ed Asner, the actor. But Guy Bannister, as well as being a key player in the Kennedy assassination, was one of J. Edgar Hoover's first FBI agents in 1947, who was tasked with investigating UFO sightings. Now, on top of that, Richard Russell, Senator Richard Russell, who was one of the Warren Commission members that investigated Kennedy's death, he had a very significant UFO in 1955 and was actually given a behind-closed-doors briefing by the CIA on the UFO subject, aspects of which we still don't know about to this day. And, for example, Philip Corso, who co-wrote the book The Day After Roswell, he actually worked with Senator Russell. And, you have a lot of links like this, tangential links. I'll give you another example. When Kennedy was in Texas, when he was assassinated in November 1963, one of the reasons for his trip to Texas, he took a trip to Brooks Air Force Base, where he opened like a new lab, if you like, or part of the base, which was dedicated to furthering our understanding of how human beings might be affected physically by, going into space, with the lack of gravity, etc. One of the people who Kennedy actually met there was a man who was the chief surgeon at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the summer of 1947, which was reportedly when the bodies from Roswell were taken to Wright-Patterson in the, the very period when the chief surgeon worked there, and Kennedy met him 24 hours before his death. And we still don't know all the entire conversation that went on between the two. So in other words, you have strands like this, and I probably have somewhere in the region of, probably 30, 40 strands like that. And I think when you see the sheer scale of people who've been involved in the intelligence world as it relates to UFOs, and then suddenly they pop up in 1963 with the Kennedy assassination, to me, it does go beyond coincidence. Now, I don't say that's necessarily the only reason he was killed. There could well be a situation where there were countless people in the official world who wanted Kennedy gone. Some because he was going to expose the truth about UFOs, some because he wanted, the troops out of Vietnam, others because of his, views on Cuba, etc. And it may well be that, there was like a cabal got together and said, we all want this guy gone, let's work together to do it. And that may explain why, you find the hand of all different sorts of people and groups in the assassination, like the mafia, the Russians, the CIA, the FBI. If they all had a role to play, it might be that, people have said, well, all these theories can't be correct. But if you did have actually a whole range of different bodies and people all involved in wanting the man gone, rather than just one group or one individual, then that might explain why we see so many different theories. They might all have some merits, everybody's working to their own agenda, but the main agenda that they all agree on is get rid of Kennedy.
For something to be so big as, let's say, UFOs and the secret space program and others, how do they keep this big secret departmentalized from the rest of the NASA employees?
Well, I think a lot of it probably comes down to the very careful process by which people are vetted before, they're sort of invited into this elite group. It's kind of like I said earlier that, people think if you join the CIA, you know all the secrets about UFOs and Roswell and who killed Kennedy. Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure that the reality of the situation, if you join the CIA and you're shown to have an aptitude for example, faking documents to confuse the enemy, put them on a false trail, just having running around chasing the tail, so to speak, and you show an aptitude for that sort of work, you get trained and briefed on that sort of thing. But I think the reason why the secrecy works, number one, is because these people are extremely careful how and when and under what circumstances they vet and allow people in if they feel they can help, offer some value to the program. And I think the other reason why the secrecy is so widely held and deeply held is because so many people flat out just don't believe this is going on. It's like the mainstream media a lot of the mainstream media won't look into the UFO subject. Now, a lot of people have said, and I think there is an aspect to this, that maybe the media has been warned off or, to a degree, controlled to stay away from the UFO subject. But equally, I think there are a lot of mainstream investigative journalists who won't touch the subject because they fear being labelled as, the guy in Washington, on the press corps who chases little green men. They're worried about their reputations. And so, ironically, the very people who could possibly have the clout and the power to uncover these conspiracies and dig into them further won't do so because of their, the fear of ridicule as to what their colleagues and peers will say. But you combine that with the black budget angle and, the fact that people are deeply and carefully vetted, I think it's no wonder, really, we're still sort of banging on doors for answers.
What role, Nick, did Carl Wolf have with the moon?
Oh, well, Carl Wolf is very interesting story. He was a former U.S. Air Force guy who went public in 2001 with a fascinating story about how in 1965 he was assigned to a project at Langley Air Force Base where he was working with people on a NASA program. And he said that while he was at the base, this is sort of an extended period of time, he got speaking, and became friends with some of the personnel there. And on one occasion, had an occasion to speak with an airman who was seemed sort of upset and troubled and wanted to get something off his chest, but didn't really know what to say or how to say it. So he just came out and told Carl Wolf, and he said that NASA had at the base a number of photographs that had been taken from one of the lunar orbiter missions over the far side of the moon, seemed to show what looked like a huge constructed installation of some sort on the far side of the moon. Now, we call it the far side of the moon because although the moon orbits around the Earth, it doesn't spin on its orbit, so it always presents the same face to us. So we never get to see the far side. So, in other words, unless you actually send around there to orbit it, it's the only way to get pictures, really. And this guy told Carl Wolf that, these pictures seem to show what essentially looks like like a space city or some sort of vast installation. And Carl Wolf realized that, as fascinating as this was, this guy had obviously just violated security to a fairly significant degree. So Carl Wolf brought the conversation to a close, but he was very excited and thought, wow, this is going to be big news. It's going to be on all the news channels in the next few months or weeks even, maybe. But, of course, that didn't happen. And then the realization hit home with Carl Wolf that it was never going to happen. Whatever they found, these pictures and the story was just not going to surface. And the important thing about Carl Wolf is that not only did he go public in 2001 with his real name, and people were actually able to verify, his position, his military history, etc. So in other words, here was a highly credible, decorated individual speaking about a profound event involving NASA and the possibility of somebody, possibly using the moon as like a staging post almost, some sort of alien civilization that, the idea, I guess, hypothetically of course, but the idea being maybe these things don't sort of flip back and forth from their world to ours, but actually have, locations, bases, facilities, etc., maybe on the Earth or even on the moon itself.
Many theorize that these UFOs that everyone sees across the world are coming from the dark side of the moon. And could this be this dark side of the moon? Could this where all these abductions are taking place?
Well, it could be. To me, it makes unless somebody out there has found a way to really sort of travel from point A to point B in a way that doesn't sort of represent regular sort of linear travel. It's like you jump on the highway and you've got a 4-hour journey. It's going to take 4 hours. But people talk about things like wormholes where you manipulate and warp space and time to where a vast journey could be done in a matter of seconds. Maybe even light years could be traveled in a matter of seconds. Now, if that can be done, then, you could go back and forth. If it can't be done, but so you're still reliant on, traveling at vast speeds, but it makes it potentially unfeasible to just keep going back and forth, then it would make more sense to have possibly permanent installations even in our solar system, because, the distances are just not that far at all. We have stories coming from the moon. We have stories about the town of Dulce in New Mexico, in northern New Mexico, where there have been a lot of rumors and stories about underground installations, whether alien originated or government created or even both, involving with cattle mutilations and abductions and all sorts of strange things. I've been on a number of expeditions to Puerto Rico looking for the so-called chupacabra, and on pretty much every expedition I've been there, I've heard stories from people who said they've seen like massive UFOs coming out of the oceans, the ocean waters surrounding Puerto Rico, which has given rise to a belief that's quite widespread on the island that there could be some sort of deep underwater installation somewhere off the coast of Puerto Rico. So to me, this makes more sense, the idea that the sheer scale and number of reports that we have of UFOs, it would make more sense that, they're not coming from here to there, then going back. They're here, period,
Speaking of chupacabras, the werewolves, and Bigfoot, I'm going to have you come back on the show to talk about that, because that's always been a very fascinating topic to me, and I've always used to love watching documentaries when I was younger about Bigfoot and werewolves. But, Nick, did we really land on the moon, or is that just a hoax?
Well, personally, Mike, I think we did land on the moon. I think we did go. I think there is enough evidence to suggest that, for example, the substantial amount of moon rock that was brought back, and, the fact that the missions were tracked. The missions were even tracked by the Russians. We know that now, and I think that if the Russians had any idea that it was faked, they would have said so, because it would have been such a disastrous outcome for the U.S. that, the Russians would have, it would have finished the U.S. presidency probably. It could have plunged the entire nation into a state of, apathy and, cynicism. The fact that the Russians didn't capitalize on it if they knew it was faked suggests to me it wasn't faked. But what I do think is that, like with the story of Carl Wolf, I certainly don't think we've had the full story of what happened when some of the astronauts were on the moon. There are a lot of stories about astronauts seeing UFOs and having encounters or seeing strange things hovering over the surface of the moon. But that sort of footage, photographs, we don't have that. So I do think there is a fair degree or a high degree of secrecy surrounding some of the moon landings and the flights to the moon, with probes and orbital craft, that sort of thing, taking pictures. But I don't think, we know even half the story of what they might have photographed or filmed, hence these stories like Carl Wolf's. And, you could argue that might be one of the reasons why we would have a clandestine space program, because it would actually allow us to go back in stealth mode, if you like, and, look into some of these areas further without all the world's press, poking their noses in, as the government would see it, to see what's going on.
For what purpose or agenda would we fake these moon landings?
Well, as I said, I don't think they were fake, but I think if they were faked, then, it would be done to sort of, I guess, try and instill military superiority over the Russians, or scientific superiority, and even like psychological superiority as well, but as I said, if it was faked, I think, that the very people who were tracking, like the Russians, that I don't think, if they had even the slightest inkling that the missions were faked, I think they would have publicly said so, because it would have been so damning to America if it was proven true. But, they said, well, yeah, okay, they beat us there. So, I think for that reason we did go, but as I said, in terms of whether or not we know exactly what happened when the astronauts were there, that's a totally different scenario.
And I also agree. I believe that, it was more of like a psychological warfare between us and Russia. And And are we still in this game against Russia and exploring space?
Well, You know, I mean, to a degree, I think, yes. I mean, you know, it's like, for example, I mean, the Russians put the first satellite in space, the first animal in space, and the first man in space. So, you know, the only way to, and the first woman in space, and so really the only way to beat that was to go to the moon first, put men on the moon, which, you know, America did. And, you know, rightly so, it sort of left its mark in history, which will never be, you know, sort of defeated now. But I do think, you know, even to this day, there is a degree of, and I think this is sort of relevant to all countries, really. You know, everybody wants to kind of be the top dog. Everybody wants to be the first with, you know, the new idea. Mm-hmm. And it's not just because it's something new. It's because psychologically, when you trump another nation who may be a bit of a rival, it does create like a bit of a psychological setback. And if you look back historically at NASA's missions throughout the years, yes, you know, they're deeply rooted in scientific investigation. But, you know, there's absolutely no doubt that when Kennedy in 1962 said, you know, we're going to put men on the moon before 1970, although there was a scientific angle to it, there's no doubt a lot of it was because it was the height of the Cold War. You know, we've just got to beat the Russians and then just, you know, give them the sort of the equivalent of a slap around the face to say, hey, you know, beat that, you know. And
you hear this all the time from people, you know, whenever they talk about us going to the moon, or was it a fake, or if it wasn't a fake, but how come we haven't been back to the moon, Nick?
Well, you see, yeah, that's another one of the big questions that, you know, that sort of prompts people to think, well, maybe there is a secret space program, you know. I mean, the fact is that really, if you look at the Apollo missions, it was literally just a handful of missions, you know, with 3 astronauts on each flight, of only 2 of who actually landed. You know, one guy remained in the capsule orbiting the moon itself. So, you know, you literally just have, you know, a handful, just barely into double figures, of people who actually walked on the surface of the moon. And the big question is, you know, why, after 1972, did it all come to a halt? Why didn't we hear any more about these stories about further missions, about moon bases being built? You know, it was just, okay, we've been to the moon, we made a quick trip there, now let's just focus on, you know, sending things up like space satellites. You know, to me, you know, this sort of flies in the face of every other American tradition to try and be the best and try and further extend and, you know, capitalize on new innovations and keep furthering them and furthering them. But it was, next year it'll be 40 years since the last man landed on the moon. You know, to me, that is the one aspect that you would expect to be furthered even more, you know, bases than semi-permanently manned bases, or even permanently manned bases. And, you know, I think this is one of the reasons why people say, well, why didn't we go back? Well, maybe we actually have. Maybe it's just that most of us are out the loop. You know, we don't know about it.
Yeah, I also believe the same thing. And are these structures that you were talking about earlier, that Carl Wolf got into on the moon, are they legit?
Well, you know, I mean, the one big problem is not, I mean, he's legit. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And other people, I mean, for example, you know, other people have come forward. Ingo Swann, who was one of the U.S. government's main remote viewers in the 1970s. Remote viewers being people, you know, who use sort of psychic powers to spy on the enemy, you know, the CIA and the Army and the Defense Intelligence Agency and people like that. They spent a lot of time training people to sort of almost like astrally project their soul, I guess, to, you know, to spy on secret files in the Kremlin and things like that. It sounds, you know, strange, but I mean, a lot of work was put into this, and there are actually a lot of successes. But one of the main players in this, as I said, was a man named Ingo Swann. And he's gone public and told a story about how in the 1970s, late 70s, he was contacted by a man in the U.S. intelligence community who wanted him to basically remote view the moon. And this man, it was sort of almost like a deep throat sort of Watergate type scenario where he would have, I guess, like clandestine meetings, secret meetings with this man who identified himself only by the name of Mr. Axelrod, but he admitted that wasn't his real name. And and basically Ingo Swann was hired to do this work, and the inference was that they wanted the moon remote viewing because they believed there was something up there and they wanted to know what it was. And when Ingo Swann viewed the moon, RV'd it, he said that he had this imagery in his mind of like these underground installations and people or entities working in them, which, didn't appear to be human. He said they actually looked human-like, but, there's no evidence, publicly that there was a moon base built by us, and if it was built by us, why were the U.S. intelligence community using remote viewers to see who built it? It wouldn't make sense. So, in other words, whoever built it, there was the inference of Ingo Swann's story is that there were people in the government who knew by the 70s as well, never mind the mid-60s with Carl Wolf, that there was some sort of installation either on or under the moon, possibly more likely, or perhaps a bit of both. And they wanted to know what was going on there, who built it, and the scope of it, etc., etc. So we have quite a few stories like this of people talking about photographs, NASA reportedly having pictures that have censored, that have never surfaced into the public domain, and stories like those of Ingo Swann. And it's kind of like the JFK UFO thing. When you put all the separate stories together, you actually see a very clear picture that all kind of ties in with the idea of like installations and underground cavernous constructions on the moon.
Since we're on the moon right now, have you heard or did you read the article about Russia vows to build base on moon? It's off the Telegraph, the UK Telegraph.
Yeah, and 30, 40 years, NASA, the US Army, actually in the late 50s and early 60s, they had a program called Project Horizon, which was a plan to put a base on the moon. Now, what was interesting is that they said that they could get the first rudimentary steps of it built by 1965, which happened to be the year when Carl Wolf was told this story about a base on the moon that NASA had found. You could argue that if this was a secret US Army program, as it was, now the official story is that it was cancelled, but if it wasn't cancelled, it's entirely possible the Army, carried out this super secret program without NASA's knowledge, and NASA goes up there, flies a probe around the moon and says, what the hell's that? Not realizing that another arm of the US government may have built it. But this story about the Russians, when you see that the Army back in 59 was working on this Project Horizon program, it's actually not at all unfeasible today. In fact, it's quite easy to do something like this. The plans are basically to kind of where you would have something like a North or South Pole military outpost. It'd be fairly small and rudimentary to start with, but you would build it in a fashion where you'd have like small connecting tunnels, and then you'd create like a large igloo type, construction fixed to that, and then you'd have another tunnel, then you build another construction. So eventually it would sort of mutate into a fairly large site. But you could build it fairly rudimentary to start with, have the astronauts living and working in one part, adding another part, and then pumping air through, atmosphere, etc., and then start moving in that part, and then add to it, and add to it, and add to it. So over time, in other words, you wouldn't need hundreds of people up there at any given time building it. You could actually just have a fairly small handful that, with the right tools and the right materials, could add a bit by bit this week and another bit next month, and that sort of thing. And so, I think it's on the cards that it's going to happen if it hasn't happened already. It just depends, who does it first, and, would they have some sort of legal claim to the moon? That's one of the other interesting areas. If you have a base there, does it mean you've just got a base, or are you the owner of it? There's a lot of legal issues as well, I think, that would sort of come forward.
Yeah, I had the article right here in front of me, and it says a manned mission to Mars would be possible in the 2030s, they added. But Russian scientists, or I'm quoting right here, Russian scientists have touted the moon as a potential source of energy, saying it contains large reserves of helium-3, a sought-after isotope that may be the key to a new way of generating power. Okay, whoever goes to the moon first, us or the Russians, okay, they say that they would like to go for the energy. They say that as a front for us to think that's what their agenda is. But behind the scenes, could it be something else?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there could be a number of reasons. I mean, one could be to have the ability to stay there and explore the moon's surface for a lengthy period of time and, look for these various anomalies that have been reported, like these underground constructions. A lot of people have talked about what looks like massive evidence of advanced mining operations on the moon, obviously undertaken by somebody else. So, in other words, if you can have a manned presence there, that gives you the ability to do all that. Look out for the whole UFO phenomenon as well. If there is evidence of UFOs on the moon, well, the best place to be to find the answers is on the moon, rather than having to keep making trips back and forth. And, I do actually think also, although this acts as the creation of a moon base does allow for these sort of secret programs to go ahead, I think there is also a good argument for saying, that the idea of taking minerals, etc., from the moon is also quite a valid one. We do that exactly on Earth. We extract oil, we extract, certainly differences, but you can actually extract oxygen, from minerals, etc. You could actually have a base which becomes self-sustaining because it relies upon the natural, the natural makeup of the moon itself to allow the astronauts to live. And when you have an atmosphere and you start bringing plants and trees and things like that, where you get, the plants taking carbon dioxide, give out oxygen, then you start having a viable full-time solid environment. And I think it's whatever you want to do up there, you're far away from prying eyes as well.
Yeah, and here's another article that says Barack Obama plan kills moon funding, NASA Constellation Eris Orion. And it seems like that we're going to be, or the U.S. is going to be a very long time until we explore space, it seems like. It seems like the Chinese and the Russians are going to beat us to the moon and Mars.
Oh yeah, I think this is a dangerous area because the Earth has become massively militarized. The idea that everybody on the planet who has militarized the Earth won't do exactly the same thing in outer space. But of course they will. It's inevitable. That's what human beings do. We militarize everything and kill each other. It's what we're good at doing. And so in that respect, I think, it's a lot of people think, or take the view that outer space research, trying to determine the makeup of the atmosphere of Venus or whatever is pointless when jobs are being lost or whatever. And, I do understand that line of thinking. But today's world goes far beyond just scientific exploration. When you have countries who may start setting up space-based weapons in orbit, or fleets of space-based weapons on the surface of the moon aimed at this country or that country, that goes beyond just the idea of having a space program and debating whether we should be, spending millions on analyzing rocks brought back from Mercury. That's very different from saying, well, China or Russia or whoever access space-based weapons now. Hypothetically, in 2030, people might be saying, well, how come the Russians and the Chinese have got all these weapons pointing at us? Why did we cancel our space program? Why didn't we follow the same trend they were following? And, everybody's looking up at the moon, realizing that there's some hugely advanced weapon pointing down at them. That's like a big psychological impact as well,
I heard this theory a while back. I can't remember exactly when it was, Nick, but it was something about these space weapons that we have, in orbit around the Earth, that they were facing outwards away from the Earth. Did you hear about that?
Yeah, I've heard that. I don't know to what extent it's true or not. A lot of it, granted, is at rumor level. But, over the years, even as far back as, the 60s, has been sort of a recognition that, having a militarized space fleet would be something to capitalize upon. And even when, for example, when Ronald Reagan was president in the 80s, he theorized and was a big champion of the idea of the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, which would essentially be like, laser weapons to shoot down missiles. The Russians launch nuclear missiles, and as they're, taking off and hitting the skies, you would have weapons in space that would kind of shoot, somebody firing a catapult bottles on a wall or whatever. You'd just zap them one by one from Earth orbit. There's no reason why, satellites and space-based weaponry can't be altered in their trajectory, etc. It's easy to alter the orbit and trajectory of a satellite, just as easy to alter or manipulate, a space-based weapon from pointing at Moscow to pointing towards the moon or whatever.
In your new book, The NASA Conspiracies, The Truth Behind the Moon Landing, Censored Photos, and the Face on Mars, I want to talk about Mars a little bit. Is the face on Mars just some trickery of light, or is it actually a real structure?
Well, NASA's public view, they don't actually shy away from talking about the face of Mars if people ask them, but their public view is that it's just a trick of the light. They kind of equate it to people seeing faces in clouds, that sort of thing. But when I was doing the research for the book, I interviewed a lot of people who had involvement in the entire face on Mars research community. One in particular, I did an extensive series of interviews with Mac Tonis, who wrote a book in 2004 called After the Martian Apocalypse. And having interviewed Mac specifically, I came away I wouldn't say pretty much convinced, I would say convinced that the face on Mars is evidence of some sort of very ancient artificial structure. Now, what it is, that's the big question. A lot of the researchers do feel that the face is actually like a huge mesa, similar to a mesa you would have on the Earth, but it's one that's been altered by intelligent beings using some sort of like mega-scale engineering, where they've essentially used a huge natural formation, but then re-sculpted it to look just like a face. And of course, if this is true, it sort of leads on to a number of profound questions, one being, when was it built? Some people theorize we could be talking 100,000 years, a quarter of a million, at a point when Mars would clearly have been very different atmosphere-wise, terrain-wise, etc., to what we see today, this sort of dusty red world with a hostile atmosphere. If we look at Mars from the satellite photographs, we see a lot of evidence of what looks like ancient shorelines of huge lakes and even oceans. So clearly, at some point in Mars's past, it may not have been too dissimilar to the Earth. But if that was the case, then there must have been clearly some sort of just gigantic planetary-wide disaster, that just destroyed the atmosphere and just spiraled the planet into not literal destruction, but in terms of have been a viable world, for the most part at least, I wouldn't say completely. And maybe the things that you would see survive, the last remnants, even after this amount of time, would be the more sturdy things like regular natural disasters, but ones that have been carved. You might still see the remnants of these carvings. Now, on top of that, there's the question was, why does the face look so much like a human face? People speculated, like Mac did, is it possible that the Martians, were very much like us in terms of the way they looked? Is it possible that when they had advance warning that, their planet was going to be destroyed or the atmosphere was going to be whatever, some of them made a last-ditch effort to survive and came to the Earth, possibly colonize the Earth? Ironically, could we be the descendants of the Martians? You have these sort of profound questions, and even if you look at some of the photographs that Mars has declassified today, we see evidence of other anomalies on Mars, not just the face. Not too far from the face itself, there are a number of structures that look eerily like Egyptian pyramids. And because the face itself looks kind of like the Sphinx, people have drawn parallels. Well, does that mean these entities were somehow involved in, the pyramids in ancient Egypt? Is it part of history we don't know about? There are other weird things. For example, NASA's declassified some photographs that seem to show vegetation on the moon. If you type into like Google banyan tree plus Mars, BANYAN, you see these weird structures that look, for all the world, they look like almost like orchards of small, weird-looking bushes and trees. You know, kind of things if you're flying over Arizona and you see a bunch of bushes on a mountain, you know, in Nevada or somewhere like that. That's exactly what they look like. NASA just says it's like ice crystal formations, but you know, if you look at them, they look like vegetation. So I'm not entirely convinced that Mars is a literal dead world. I think, you know, and people have remote viewed Mars as well and have said, you know, they've seen deep underground caverns where there are, you know, surviving highly intelligent entities sort of hiding out, hunkered down, despite the harsh conditions. And you know, when you see other pictures like this, I think Mars is far from a dead world. You know, we haven't got evidence of oceans and, you know, wildlife, animals running around, but at a harsh, restricted level, you know, I think there is evidence that something has survived in quite a few places on the planet.
I'm a firm believer that we are the descendants of these ancient Martians. I believe it's, well, I don't want to say firm believer, but I believe it's very possible that we are the descendants of these ancient Martians. But I also hear that, and you know, it's a big theory, especially in a bunch of forums on websites, and other researchers talk about it, that a lot of these Martians are actually still there, but they're not on the surface, they're underground. Have you looked into that any?
Yeah, I actually have, and I mean, again, a lot of this comes from the remote viewers. You know, the problem is that most of us, if not 99.9% of us, we can't go to Mars. You know, maybe there's a space program, a secret space program that's visited Mars and has all the answers. You know, I wouldn't if that was proven to be the case, I wouldn't exactly in a dead faint. It would surprise me. But what I also think is that, you know, when we see things like remote viewers checking out the planet, which I do believe remote viewing is a genuine, real tool, and they've spoken about this, you know, that the surface, yeah, it's very harsh, but way below the planet, you know, there are pockets of these highly intelligent that have made a world for themselves down there, and, you know, they're actually viable and hospitable. You know, it's not just a case of them being sort of ragged remnants struggling to survive. You know, that they've made a viable home for them. When you hear stories like this, you know, and you see these stories about vegetation and photographs showing anomalies and things, I think, you know, the idea that there could be a deeply buried civilization, I mean, literally deeply buried, isn't too strange. You know, it's like, for example, all across the major developed countries, you know, for years, nations have secretly been building underground bunkers in the event of a nuclear war, where, you know, the sort of the echelons of the government will go, well, the rest of us are sort of left upstairs to fry, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for example, I mean, there's actually one under the White House. The stories that when 9/11 attacks happened, and Dick Cheney was sort of famously taken to an undisclosed location, one of the potential candidates that was put forward was a place called Raven Rock, not too far from Camp David. And Raven Rock is like a huge installation that can literally house thousands of people. It has its own circulated air, water supply, even helipad. So in other words, you know, there's a lot of places like this, underworld places where, you know, if there was some huge disaster on the surface of the planet, a substantial number of people could go underground and survive in them. Or places, you know, like NORAD, the North American Air Defense Command in Cheyenne Mountain. Where is it? Colorado. The NORAD installation at Cheyenne Mountain, I mean, that's literally built into a mountain. You know, it's like, who knows how much sort of burrowing and quarrying has been done to further extend some of these places to even greater levels. You know, we just don't really know. So in that respect, the idea that somebody else might have done the same thing on another planet isn't so out of the ordinary when we're doing precisely the same thing to anticipate disasters here.
The Cydonia region, which homes the face on Mars and the five-sided pyramids, does that have any connection or correlation with Egypt?
Well, I mean, it does in the sense that, the face looks eerily Sphinx-like.
Yeah.
And NASA, again, doesn't avoid talking about these pyramid-type formation, but they just basically say, well, with the harsh conditions on Mars, and weathering over the years, and the wind blasting in certain directions, it's created, very angular-looking rocks. But I mean, if you look at these photographs, in all honesty, they don't look like weathered rocks. They look like you're looking at a satellite image of, a satellite going over Egypt, a NASA satellite or a spy satellite, and taking pictures of the pyramids. That's literally what it looks like. And of course, the mere fact that you have these five-sided pyramids near to this Sphinx-like face, has led a lot of people, quite justifiably, I think, to say this is just not feasible to be a coincidence that we have such similar formations in Egypt. Now, one of the interesting things about the Egyptians, if you look at a lot of our cultures, they expanded, slowly, and then as technology develops, it sort of goes at a quicker rate. But it still develops. We go from like cavemen and hunter-gatherers, then we develop the wheel, horse and carts, and then the industrial age, steam engines, cars, propeller-driven aircraft, jet engines, atomic power spacecraft, computers, internet. But we still develop over time. The Egyptians, it was almost like they came out of nowhere. There was a hunter-gatherer type environment in the area, and then suddenly you've got these vast structures and giant rocks, weighing tons, carefully placed, however many feet on top of each other, which, still puzzles people today how it was done. So in other words, it's almost like Egypt flourished out of nowhere, and the technology to build the pyramids flourished out of nowhere. You have to wonder, some of these stories about the Egyptian gods coming down and helping them and, having interaction with the Egyptians, was that the Martians fleeing their world? Did they was their architecture pyramids and, sphinxes, and did they, and, they wanted to save elements of their society, and so they taught the locals here, what to build and how to build it, because it allowed the Martians some semblance of identity, something for them to hang on to from civilization that was sort of pummeled on its own planet. And, maybe the irony is we've forgotten a lot of our origins. It's become so fog-shrouded in the past that, we just assume, people say, well, how did all the pyramids? Oh, well, it was rocks and it was pulling levers and rope. That's what people say, but they never really explain how you get like a multi-ton rock on top of another using a rope,
Yeah, it was 100,000 men with a rope pulling the rocks up the hill, and I mean, to me, there has to be another answer. And what's interesting is that there are a number of cultures around the world that built pyramids or built large stone circles, and a lot of them actually have legends about how the people could sort of strike the rock and create almost like an acoustic wave, which would levitate the rocks. So it was kind of like utilizing and manipulating sound waves and acoustics to actually move vast rocks. Now, maybe that's some sort of ancient technology that we've lost. I think there's actually something to be said for the idea that a lot of these ancient civilizations that built these undeniably massive structures that still puzzle us today, we don't necessarily see evidence of them building like 747s and computers because we're just not finding that, and I think we would have stumbled across a few things like that. But we are seeing evidence of them outwitting us in other ways, like, these just baffling huge structures. So I think they may have had access to a technology that wasn't necessarily, technologically based as we see technology, but technologically based in a different fashion, and maybe one that would allow for, these vast structures to be built, but we've lost whatever that technology is. Maybe it was something linked with acoustics and almost like sound weaponry that is being researched now, where you can literally use sound as a force, if you like. I kind of see another book coming along, Nick.
Well, I've always had something going. I mean, I'm fascinated with all this stuff. I think, like I said at the start, one of the big considerations is having enough material, to do this. But I think, there is evidence to show, ancient man did have access to a lot of technologies that, we've lost. But I mean, there are a lot of people who've been doing this sort of research far better than, I ever could. I'd be kind of stumbling around where people have been doing this for years, really. So,
But I think if you write a book about this, I'm gonna buy it, because you seem like kind of like Jim Marrs to me. You know a lot about a good bit about a lot of things, and so if you write about ancient Egypt and all these other mysteries and technology from the ancient past, I sure will buy it. But let's get back to Mars, Nick. Out of all these photos that have been declassified on Mars, how many photos out there are still classified and hidden from the public?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, we have a lot of interesting imagery, and as I said, NASA doesn't deny the existence of it. But when something anomalous turns up in a photograph, NASA, for the most part, says, well, we think it can be explained as this. It's not like they're saying, we have no comments, this picture's going to be withdrawn and classified. But actually saying, oh, well, we think, like these banyan trees, we think it's ice crystals. And of course, with Mars being so far away, no one can actually dispute it. So, in other words, when we talk about how many photos are still classified, in many respects, it may not matter if they're declassified or not, because NASA, as the ones who declassified them, and largely the people pulling the strings, can say, well, we've analysed them and we think it's just a rock. It's like the face on Mars. If that's an artificial construction, which I think it is, then arguably that would be classified. But because the pictures were overlooked and declassified, NASA didn't scramble to hide them. They just said, oh, it's just, it's a rock formation, and when the light's in the right place and the shadows are in the right place, it looks like a face. So in other words, I'm not sure, unless something really was like a real smoking gun where it showed like a clearly constructed city, or if you like, in simple terms, something like that, I suspect that if something gets overlooked and declassified, they don't worry too much, because they can just say, oh, it's the shadows, it's the light, or whatever. So.
The reason why NASA and the government won't, kind of disclose the true origins and all this information about Mars and also the moon and about UFOs, is it because that they're afraid that it could interrupt people's religious institutions and other people's faith?
Yeah, I actually do believe that's a lot of it, Mike. I think one of the main reasons I believe that is because, if there was, as I honestly do accept, that there was an ancient Martian race, and some of their technologies, if you like, and things like the pyramids and the face on Mars look so Egyptian-like that if they came to the Earth and kind of incorporated and fused their culture into ours, then they may well have been responsible for some of these stories about the gods coming down from the skies and, teaching people how to live, which they might have done. If you had a small armada of craft coming to the Earth and you land and you find it's populated by savages, well, and you don't want these savages killing you, if you've just landed, with a few craft and 20 or 30 people trying to repopulate the Martian species, and you're faced with these savages, you've got to control them. What do? Well, how about we create a religion and say we're gods and you've got to worship us? If that was the truth and that was proven, then that could actually undermine entire world religions and bring them crashing down. And I think it could well be the case that there are people in government who know this or secretly suspect it. And the idea of bringing down massive, well-established religious institutions, which could bring down civilization in many respects, for people who adhere to these beliefs, they just bury it. It's just not worth, from the government's perspective, digging into this can of worms. They don't want religion being undermined by the fact that maybe some of our legends of gods are actually surviving astronauts fleeing their world, coming here and trying to, control us to prevent, them taking us over. Let's portray ourselves as gods instead of Martians, and then they're going to bow down for us and do what we say.
A few of my listeners that are fans of yours knew that I was going to be conducting this interview with you, and they wanted me to ask you a few questions. And one of them is, what? Let me see here. Let me try to find it. Oh, are UFOs coming from some other dimension, or are they coming from our future, as many speculate?
Well, it's interesting, Mike. When I first got into the whole UFO subject as a kid, it was also black and white, but it was all alien, literally extraterrestrial. I would definitely say over about the last 15 years to an extent, a lot of my views have changed. Not in the sense that there's not a phenomenon, that there's clearly a phenomenon, a UFO phenomenon of unknown origins. I'm not entirely sure it's literally extraterrestrial, or if it could be some sort of extra-dimensional, interdimensional, multi-dimensional, from some other plane of existence, which, I guess that still makes it definitively alien in the sense that it's not human and it's really weird. But maybe we're not dealing with something that's coming from planet A and traveling to planet B. Maybe it's something that kind of coexists and has the ability to flit in and out of our reality, and that might explain why we have so many UFO reports, because they're not literally traveling from one solar system or galaxy to another. It's kind of like, just in simple terms, tuning your car radio from one station to another. You listen to one station, you tune to another, but they're all ongoing at the same time. And I think the time travel one is an interesting one as well. I actually have a new book coming out next month called The Real Men in Black, and that's one of the theories I discuss in the book, is, whether the men in black could be time travelers. The notion that if you are from the far future and you want to visit the distant past, or our present as it is, maybe you would want to try and disguise yourself. You wouldn't want to reveal who you are. You're from the future, because it might upset the timeline if anything happened to you. So you stay in the background and you hide yourself under like a disguise of being aliens, and then nobody really gets wind of who you are, because if they did have an understanding and they found out and somebody shoots you, how does that affect the future? Excuse me. So I think all these theories are interesting, and I wouldn't be surprised if the answer isn't just one thing. We may be looking at, it's our tendency to think that all the unknown UFO activity has one point of origin. Maybe some of it doesn't. Maybe some is extraterrestrial. Maybe some is other dimensions or portals. Maybe in the future somebody has discovered time travel. Perhaps there's like a whole swirling mix of weird stuff going on, and we're trying to make sense of it under one thing, and it's actually, half a dozen things maybe.
Here's a good one, Nick. What type of role did NASA have in the SERPO project? This is another interesting one. SERPO, being this reported project where supposedly in the 60s there was a program where like a team of US personnel traveled to some alien world, and the story is that the aliens, it was like an exchange, if you like, and some of them came here. And it's kind of like a lot of people suggested it's very similar to the last scene in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where a number of human astronauts or human beings are chosen or picked to go back with the aliens after they've sort of completed their mission. It's also in the X-Files too.
Yeah, that's right. And it's been picked up, a number of themes like this. And, the SERPO story is interesting because it's so intricate. You have these documents, reams and reams of material, which, somebody has sort of spent an extraordinary amount of time putting together. And the interesting thing is that even without the SERPO documents, this story about some sort of exchange program in the 60s or 70s has actually been circulating in the UFO field for a good number of years, even way back to the 1970s. So in other words, it has an origin that beyond just the more recent story. Now, to what extent this involves NASA, that's the bigger question. There seems to be a lot of indications that from the story that this was like a military program. These are military personnel chosen for a specific mission rather than something, based out of the Johnson Space Center or the Kennedy Space Center on behalf of NASA. I think again, there's evidence for some of these more deeper programs not to have had any sort of NASA involvement at all, which is ironic given that NASA, the US's main space agency, or the space agency. But again, that would possibly allow for some of these black budget programs to go on. And maybe, SERPO or something like it would fall into that category.
Here's the final question from one of my listeners. Are triangle UFOs a part of the secret space program, or are the triangle UFOs a part of some other government agency?
Well, again, this could be several things. These so-called black flying triangles are interesting because, for the most part, the sightings have really proliferated in the last sort of 25 years, sort of early 80s onwards, mid-80s onwards. And most of them are sort of described as very large, black, with three lights underneath them, and they make like this low, droning, humming noise, which some people have said has felt like a very unpleasant feeling. It's made them feel sick when it's kind of vibrated through their body. Some people take the view that they're kind of like a prototype next-generation stealth aircraft, although, you could argue, well, if they've been flying for 20 years, why? And they're just a replacement for the stealth. Why not say so? Everybody's seen the weird stealth bomber and the stealth fighter, these black triangular-shaped craft. If we've got a replacement, why not just say so? Why the secrecy? I think there's possibly two ideas. One is that they really are some sort of secret spacecraft. If they were just an aircraft of the military, as I said, and they're designed to replace the existing stealth bomber, well, replace it. What's the big deal? But if we're looking at something that is literally taking off and leaving the Earth orbit, and who knows, visiting the moon, Mars, I don't actually rule that out, as fantastic as some people might think it to sound. That would make sense. But what makes it even weirder is that one of the projects that I went on or investigated on a few years ago was to look at how far back in time these flying triangle reports had been made. And using the British government's Freedom of Information Act, I actually got hold of files from 1965 that talked about how in one particular late night in, I forget the month now, but it was 1965 in the county of North Yorkshire, a man named Jeffrey Brown, his name's actually mentioned in the files, saw like a fleet of flying triangles flying over this remote area of moorland. And he described these objects back in 65, and the files have been now declassified. He described exactly like the flying triangles of today. They were large, they had the typical rounded corners rather than the sharp points. They had lights beneath them, and they were giving off this eerie humming noise, which is quite unpleasant, which is all these characteristics of what people reported today. And yet this was nearly 50 years ago, so 46 years ago now. So, if identical flying triangles are being seen 46 years ago, then you have to wonder, well, is it really us flying them after all, or could they be alien craft? It's actually the case that, although they seem recent, I think it's more the case that we're just getting more reports today. Identical craft like this one that this fleet of craft that this guy Jeffrey Brown saw, were flying nearly 50 years ago. So, why would we hide them for that long? It makes me wonder if maybe there's, like I mentioned earlier, there's our flying triangles and somebody else's flying triangles as well, perhaps.
And I've seen one. It was in Gulf Breeze, Florida, on a vacation in 2006, and it was a very eerie thing to watch. Have you ever seen one?
I haven't, no, but I have actually got friends and colleagues who have, and they said, they just couldn't believe the sheer size of this thing, just flying or gliding like almost silently at midnight over woods or roads or whatever, and just, at low level, and then just shot away at high speed. It was just, they just sort of stood there, your mouth wide open.
Mm-hmm. To round things up for this time, Nick, what do you have coming up in the near future? Any books, lectures, or conferences?
Yeah, I haven't got any new lectures, conferences booked right now, but I will have when the new book comes out, which is The Real Men in Black, which comes out on June the 14th. And it's basically a full-length study of the entire Men in Black mystery, looking at cases, a huge number of new reports coming right up to the present day. And, lots of different theories as to who the Men in Black are. Are they government agents? Are they aliens? Are they time travelers? Are they paranormal? And again, it could be, a wide range of things. It could be, I think, more than one group of Men in Black. That's what makes it more and more difficult to understand. So that book will be out in about 5-6 weeks, something like that. Well, there's a lot of material here relative to NASA that people won't have seen before. And of course, not just as someone who writes books, but reads books as well, you want the audience and the reader to be able to get something new rather than just, going over old ground. So more than anything else, that was probably one of the main considerations in writing the book, was the fact that, I was able to bring a lot of new cases forward. And I think, people want that. You don't want to sort of spend $15 on a book and think, hang on a minute, this is just rehashed or whatever.
So I kind of want to start off with the secret space program, because I know that you've mentioned that before also on other shows. So I guess the $80 trillion question is there a secret space program that is going on and being kept from the American people?
Well, this is an interesting area because, if you look historically at the space program, when the Apollo astronauts landed on the moon in 1969, if you look back at the original newspaper articles around the world even, and the statements coming out of NASA, the Apollo missions were sort of perceived as being the first step, or the first armada, if you like, to having far more extensive missions, manned missions, to the moon. And there was a lot of talk about building like a moon base, a sort of a lunar colony that would be established and grow larger in size over time, and then using that as kind of a staging post to send missions to Mars, etc. And, the plan was to sort of, as I said, use the original moon landings as a vehicle for going further into the solar system, etc. But it's almost a case, if you look at it in black and white terms, we made sort of a short hop, skip and jump to the moon on a few missions, came back, and then not much happened between then and the space shuttle in 1981, and, that's soon to be retired. So, in other words, all these grand plans didn't come to fruition unless, as some people believe they actually did, but it was done on a more sort of clandestine basis behind the scenes. And there are a number of researchers who've made sort of valid contributions to this area about having spoken with NASA insiders and also more military insiders. Many people have suggested the idea that if there is a clandestine space program, it's actually not one of NASA's. NASA, ironically, may be in the dark. It could be some more of like a highly classified military program or something like that. And, for me, if you look at the way our technology has advanced over the last, say, half a century, if you look at things like atomic weaponry or computers, the sheer extent to which they've advanced. But, the Apollo missions that went to the moon, they were just sort of basic brute force rockets. You fill a fuel tank with fuel and use it to propel a rocket into the sky. That's pretty much what happens with the space shuttle 40-something years on after we went to the moon. You just have this huge fuel tank to which the shuttle's strapped, basically. So it's almost like every other aspect of technology is massively advanced, but with spaceflight, we're still reliant upon regular rocketry. And to me, that kind of seems...
Nick Redfern, how do you keep up with all these books? Like, you are a monster, man.
Well, basically, Mike, I work full-time as a writer anyway. I don't just sort of do the books that are sort of mainstream journalism as just regular news stories. So, I guess when you write full-time, you kind of sort of split one day between doing an article for a newspaper and then 2 days working on a book. So, I'm sort of constantly cranking something out at least, I guess.
So are you, if you don't mind me asking, you live in Texas, but you're from the UK?
Yeah, I'm originally from England. Me and my wife live in Dallas. And I've been over about 11 years, something like that. So, and, try and get back at least once a year to England and just catch up with everybody and, see what's going on.
So what inspired you to unravel these mysteries about NASA, Nick?
Well, I guess more than anything else, one of the main reasons was because, when anybody talks about NASA and conspiracy theories, there's always a tendency to focus on the more well-known things like, the face on Mars, did we go to the moon, was it all a hoax, that sort of thing. But over the years, when you kind of write books and articles, people contact you to relate their experiences. And I found, going through the sort of archives and files of letters and things I've had from people over the years, I'd actually got a lot of leads that pointed in the direction of NASA. For example, people who'd worked at NASA or who were working on NASA with NASA contractor companies and talking about their UFO experiences. And I thought, well, illogical, that aspect of technology wouldn't also have advanced. And I think one of the more interesting stories of recent years is that of Gary McKinnon, a British computer hacker who hacked into the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas in 2001. And as I'm sure you know, there's this big whole legal process that's been going on for years with attempts to get McKinnon extradited for trial in the United States. And his legal team say, no, he should stand trial in England, et cetera, et cetera. But, the guy's out on bail. He has to still report to his local police station. But he's not prevented from speaking out about his actions. And one of the things that he said, and which has been sort of widely reported in, the mainstream media even, never mind just UFO publications, is that he claims to have seen files on NASA computers that reference so-called non-terrestrial officers, very sort of strange wording. And McKinnon's view, which may well be the correct one, was that, non-terrestrial obviously means not of this Earth. Officers kind of sounds like a fleet of military personnel. When you put those two together, an off-planet fleet of military personnel, it does sound almost like a secret astronaut program. And that's exactly what McKinnon concluded it could well be. And, who knows, he may be right. He may have stumbled upon, the sort of key to what lies at the heart of this clandestine space program.
Is it possible that the majority of the black budget money is going towards the secret space program?
Well, yeah, I think, that's entirely possible. I think the big problem today is when you look at things like UFOs, the more that our technology advances, the more and more difficult it becomes to differentiate between, quote, their UFOs and our UFOs. And I think there's a very good argument for saying that some UFOs, at least, very, highly advanced ones, are actually classified prototype military vehicles, whether aircraft or even spacecraft. And I think when we talk about black budget programs, this would be the ideal way to fund such an operation. I don't personally believe that the vast majority of people in NASA know anything about, UFO conspiracies or secret space programs. I'm sure 99% of them are just dedicated workers, looking into furthering our knowledge of the solar system and outer space and space exploration. And I think this goes for all government agencies. You don't just join the CIA and you're suddenly briefed on what happened at Roswell. You're just told what you need to know to do your job. And I think that's how a lot of these potential, secret space program operations that could possibly be funded by black budget projects, that's how they work and how they succeed, because you only tell the people who need to know. And even if you have contractors building the craft, well, if somebody's working on a propulsion system, somebody else is working on another aspect, they may actually not all know what each other's doing. So, the end result, whatever the craft is, just a small body of people even get to see that. So I think, there are very valid ways as to how a secret space program could actually, handled in the right way, could be very easily and successfully coordinated.